All right, hello everyone, and welcome to Climate Reporting in America. My name is Aaron Kroll, and I lead the MIT Climate Change Engagement Program, where our mission is to bring nonpartisan, science-based information about climate change and its solutions to the public at large in ways that our audiences can understand and use, and in venues they care about and trust. Much of that mission is carried out through our program's original publications at climate.mit.edu. You can find our series of short explainers breaking down key climate change concepts, as well as our Ask MIT Climate series, where you can ask your climate questions and get answers from real scientists and experts. We also produce the podcast TIL Climate, which is one of the world's leading climate change podcasts, created to teach listeners about climate change in bite-sized 15-minute episodes with expert guests on every aspect of the climate challenge. That's TIL Climate, available wherever you get your podcasts. I'm sorry, I have to do that plug, but it really is a very good show. Today, though, we're here to highlight one of my favorite projects from our program, the MIT Environmental Solutions Journalism Fellowship. This fellowship exists to bring big, deeply reported climate stories to local newspapers and radio stations, which studies have repeatedly shown are the news sources Americans trust most. From wind power in Louisiana to heat adaptation in Arizona to changes in the energy system in Kentucky, our journalism fellows have brought outstanding climate reporting to communities who rarely find climate solutions in the spotlight, with an emphasis on why this topic matters locally. So without further ado, I am very proud to introduce our newest cohort of journalism fellows. Grace, if we could roll our video.
I'm Anastasia Huffam with the Salt Lake Tribune, and my project has investigated the resurgence of the uranium industry in southeastern Utah. My fellowship with MIT has given me access to essential science for understanding nuclear energy and the resources to report in rural areas.
Hi, I'm Phil Jankowski with the Dallas Morning News. I'm a politics reporter based in Austin, Texas. My project examines the politics surrounding climate change in Texas, its ongoing and current effects on our state's industry, and the energy transition. My MIT fellowship allowed me to shift my coverage toward climate change and is helping me build a foundation of knowledge to provide better context for my continuing coverage of energy in Texas.
Hello, my name is Alex Baumhart. I'm a journalist at the Oregon Capital Chronicle, and my MIT Climate Solutions Fellowship is exploring the potential of forests in Oregon and the Northwest to sequester and store carbon dioxide, and the growing carbon crediting markets really banking on these forests, and the potential for private, state, tribal forest land to be part of a broader tool set to reduce emissions, and whether or not they're achieving that goal in combating climate change.
Hi, my name's Reed Frazier. I'm a public radio reporter for the Allegheny Front. We're a public radio show in Pittsburgh. We focus on environmental news in this part of the country. For my MIT Environmental Solutions project, I'm focusing on the creation of a federally funded clean hydrogen hub in Appalachia. The project is allowing me to go to Sweden to investigate clean hydrogen there, where they're using renewable energy to create clean hydrogen and then using that hydrogen to create steel.
Hi, my name is Brooke Larson. I'm a freelance journalist and correspondent with High Country News. For this fellowship, I'm reporting on the energy transition in Utah's coal country, including how local communities are being impacted and how leaders are strategizing to diversify their economies. This fellowship has supported me to do a lot of in-depth on-the-ground reporting to make sure the stories I'm writing reflect the most pressing issues to the communities I'm covering.
All right, wonderful. And we have all our fellows here. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you also to our very exciting guest who has joined us to moderate this conversation. Dr. Lagipoiva Cherelle Jackson has been reporting on climate change for over 20 years in outlets including CNN, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and the Associated Press. A climate journalist, scholar, and chiefess from the island of Savaii in Samoa. Her particular focus has been on climate change in the Pacific Islands, and in that capacity, she has also reported for the Samoa Observer and Newsline Samoa, among others. Lagipoiva was the first global climate collaborations editor for the Associated Press, and today she is the director of climate journalism at the Solutions Journalism Network, whose mission is to uplift rigorously reported stories about efforts to tackle big social problems. She is also the co-chair of Covering Climate Now and a Gender Council member for the International Federation of Journalists. Lagipoiva, it's a pleasure to have you.
Thank you, Aaron and Salo Falava. Such a pleasure to be here with you all.
And just one very quick note before I turn this conversation over to Lagipoiva and our fellows. Our chat feature is disabled, but we do have a Q&A feature at the bottom of your Zoom screens. We will have a Q&A with our fellows at the conclusion of this event. So if you have questions for our fellows, if you think of any questions during this conversation, please just click the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, type your question in, and we will be keeping track of those questions and getting ready to ask them. And with that, let's jump into the conversation.
Thank you, Aaron. I feel like those introductions don't do justice to the work of our fellows here who spend so much time, and it's so exciting, and the work is so extensive. So such a pleasure for me to conduct this, moderate this discussion now. So we start with this question for Anastasia. Many of the outlets that our fellows, and in particular your outlet as well, serve audiences in parts of the country where the basic facts of climate change remain controversial, or where it's just not seen as a priority. So Anastasia, for instance, you've been reporting from rural Utah. How did you go about maintaining trust with your sources and your readers while trying to bring climate into the conversation?
Yeah, I think I would say that the first step for me is just being there, which is something that the MIT Fellowship really allows you to do, is actually to build trust with sources. They kind of need to see your face and know that you've made the effort. In my case, I live in Salt Lake City, but to go down to southeastern Utah, these really, really rural areas, and be able to talk to people and show them who I am and that I really do care about what they have to say, and how these big climate issues that are, being debated in some of our most impressive institutions do impact them as well. And as far as, maintaining trust with these sources, I think I found it most useful to really ground what I'm reporting on as far as clean energy, nuclear energy in the local. So for example, I've gone to uranium mines and our last conventional uranium mill in the United States, both in southeastern Utah, and being able to go there and then after those experiences, talk to others and say, hey, well, I've been to this mine, or I've been to this mill, and here's how this was happening, this was happening in your backyard. And being able to build from the hyper local up to these bigger climate ideas, I think is how I really was able to connect with sources and make sure that my reporting was going to have an impact there.
Thank you, Anastasia. Such an important point on understanding your local audience and keeping those ties and maintaining the trust. Now, Phil, do you find you have to be careful about the language you use during your reporting? Are there phrases that can instantly turn off a source or a reader when it's possible to have a productive conversation if you just word things differently?
My approach to that actually kind of evolved over the course of this fellowship. At the outset, I was a little bit reluctant to use, quote unquote, climate change. Was working on stories that were related to certain subjects, and would just say hey, I'm working on a story that a part of it is about this. But as that sort of moved on, the pendulum shifted there. To where I became far more upfront with what I was talking about, and that was just throughout the course of doing. Since a lot of the people that I spoke to for this project were politicians, really kind of being very specific in language. Actually, in some instances, yes, people did decline doing interviews because of the subject, but you know, a lot of, as I said, a lot of these people were politicians, so their statements were um, able to find their statements. For the folks that did do interviews, it actually became very far more specific in what I was asking them. Not, do you believe in climate change? Because a lot of these people are very skilled in using rhetoric to kind of get around the question. You know, towards the end, I would often, you know, be very upfront and offer a long prerequisite to the question, saying, I'm not, you know, do you believe that the burning of fossil fuels is what is contributing to, you know, climate change? Because with people that and that the, you know, to get to that very sort of, you know, yes or no thing. So it's a long answer to say that it sort of depended on the situation, but it changed over the course of the fellowship.
Thanks, Phil. I think that's similar to what Anastasia's been saying, but knowing your audiences and being able to relate. Sounds like you have a really good read on the agendas of your particular talents as well. So for Brooke, we've been speaking so far about ways the communities you're reporting from might have some resistance to climate reporting or climate science, but that can go both ways. People in the climate world might have unfair or unproductive ideas about these communities. Do you find you've had to deal with preconceived notions about the people you're reporting on?
Yeah, I'd say to a certain extent. And I think, I mean, this isn't like a new idea, but I think that's sort of a larger issue in journalism and just national discourse, specifically around politics these days, is just making rural communities out to be a monolith, right? And not recognizing that there are a lot of different perspectives and a diversity of people in rural communities. So I'm reporting in a similar area as Anastasia in Southeast Utah. Utah's coal country, and this is an area that has high rates of climate change denialism. Even the word energy transition can be controversial at times, but there's also a lot of people that are actively working on finding these solutions, right? And so I think there are times when I'm talking to sources, or I live in Salt Lake City, so some readers or just people in my community that may not be as familiar with this area may assume the voices that are sort of anti-climate solutions or not wanting to work on the energy transition are the only voices. And I think the problem with that is that one isn't a complete story. You know, it is in some ways silencing the other perspectives and other voices. And, you know, another dynamic is that one thing I hear from some folks is, well, why are we doing all this work for such a small area? Sort of like that these rural communities don't matter. And I think that can cause some harm too, or limit the possibility of these conversations from happening. So I do think it goes both ways. Yeah, I think these stereotypes go both ways and can cause just limit our ability to see the deeper, fuller story on these issues.
Thanks, Brooke. Being from an island, I can certainly relate to that. You know, 200,000 people for an entire country, it's very much a small town mentality where, you know, there's just not a big enough audience to serve, but there are legitimate issues like you've raised. So I just want to move on to Alex. Several of the projects that have been mentioned here and some of the work that you've done deal with climate solutions that are imperfect or controversial. Do you ever worry about honestly reporting on faults or flaws in a climate solution at a time when public support for ambitious climate action is already quite tenuous?
Yeah, I think we've talked a lot about this as a group. I sort of come from a place where there's not as much climate denialism. I think you can find a lot of East Oregon ranchers who would 100% subscribe to the idea that climate change is a problem and exists. I have sort of a different challenge, which is rose-colored glasses, sort of like startup energy about some of these new solutions and technologies that are supposed to course correct and save us in the long run. So
I think with this reporting on the potential for forests to be put into these carbon crediting markets, with that sort of startup energy, like the companies I've talked to, even the landowners, you know, in many ways, it's like this new way to make money and do what we've been doing. So I think I kept coming back to is this doing what it purports to do? Because I'll talk to landowners who say, I can invest in forest health. I can make some side money to help pay my property taxes. The carbon companies say, we're giving these big corporations a way to do something, which is great, but those aren't the answer to the question of, is this doing what it purports to do, which is help curb emissions in order to slow, climate change. So that being said, those other things deserve credit. By all intents and purposes, I've met forest landowners who have been able to invest in their forests. They have healthier forests now that can sequester more carbon because they have the money to do it, or they have the wherewithal to do it. There are companies, especially in the voluntary carbon market, that are buying these credits that don't have to, but they're investing in something that they ostensibly believe in and that they get to sell and market to their customer base. So I think in the reporting and the writing, the most central thing was, does this do what it purports to do? And if it doesn't, why? And is it solving for anything else along the way? And if it is, which I do think there are examples of this being a helpful tool, especially in regulated federal, carbon markets like those that exist in the EU. If it is working, show where it is. And I also report on education. So I feel like there's this mentality I have, like a lot of education reporters, where there are no silver bullets. Like there is no great, the one single thing that we're waiting for to completely lift every kid in the United States. But there are really obvious smart things that can start to happen. So then I say, okay, to the effect of climate change, is this a smart, obvious thing we could start doing?
I would love to jump in on this question as well.
Go ahead.
My project has really been focusing on the resurgence of the uranium industry, which has coincided with this, a push for clean energy in response to climate change. And nuclear energy is really controversial. It's especially where I am reporting the ramifications of the last uranium mining and milling boom from the 1940s to the 1980s across the American Southwest. That legacy is still really felt, and there's still a lot of fear, really understandable fear, about the environmental and public health impacts of ramping up uranium again, when, again, those effects from decades ago are still very much present. Nuclear is still really expensive. It's there are a lot of issues with it. And I found that if I went to somebody and said, well, coal is really, really harmful and bad, but the good thing is that nuclear is fantastic and has no problems, that would have actually really had the opposite effect of building trust, I think. I found that when I was really honest about the flaws that nuclear has, and the flaws of like, well, this might be a highly speculative industry, this might be a big boom and bust situation, I don't know no one really knows what's gonna happen. I found that all the people I talked to were much more willing to understand, like, oh, well, I can see, nuclear might have flaws, but so does coal, and so does oil and gas, and, here's some other solutions. And I found that really actually opened up conversation, being really honest about the imperfections in these climate solutions, rather than trying to, kind of stifle talking about them in the interest of, hoping that they'll be more open to climate change being, real.
Thank you, Anastasia. I think, that would be that you're in a difficult shoes, so to speak. And, in the Pacific Islands where there's nuclear testing sites and there's still impacts to date, it is a problematic solution. But I feel like what Alex has said in terms of approaching problematic solutions is actually an excellent way of delving into, and you have said that too, of really analyzing and critiquing these solutions to make sure that you're being accurate and true to the challenges that lie with those solutions. So Reed, we haven't forgotten you. So my question to you is, when you're reporting on a controversial climate solution, who picks up the phone for you and who doesn't pick up the phone, and how does that affect ultimately the story that you report on?
Well, it's sort of like kind of like every other journalism topic that you could focus on, there's like people that don't want you to know, don't want to talk to you for whatever reason. Either they don't have to, or it would be bad for their business or their interest to, talk to a reporter. So for my project, as background, I'm focused on a blue hydrogen hub in Appalachia. Just a little background. The federal government under the Biden administration funded 7 hydrogen hubs around the country. Hydrogen is a potential climate solution for heavy industry and other applications. Some of those hubs will be focused on renewable energy, but not the one in my neck of the woods, which is focused mostly on natural gas with some carbon capture and sequestration involved to lower the very high carbon footprint for creating blue hydrogen. That's what this is called. So the hubs are still under this mess of negotiation, and companies are coming in and out of these hubs. There's a bunch of federal subsidies for hydrogen that are still being, the rules for which are still being written. They haven't been finalized yet. And it's, what are we, almost like a couple weeks from an election? So it's all like a big sort of a lot of unknowns involved in this. And so, the people that have been really most interested in speaking with me about the hubs are mostly environmental and community groups that are not, I don't want to say opposed, but very skeptical about, building sort of billions of dollars of infrastructure around something that's predicated on fracking and natural gas, which has had, according to these groups, very deleterious effects on local communities that are closest to fracking in terms of public health and public well-being, even if they have injected some, economic activity into the region. There's still a good portion of these regions that are skeptical about continuing this sort of massive build out of the natural gas kind of infrastructure. In this case, this would be for blue hydrogen. So obviously that kind of like, if I could talk to, walk into the room where everyone's deciding what to do with all this hydrogen, then that would be awesome. But, it's sort of like all reporting, you're just sort of grasping around in the dark 95% of the time. And like occasionally you put your finger in the little grasp hold and you can kind of hang on for a little bit longer. So that's what I'm kind of doing right now.
Thanks, Reed. Do you find that you have to provide like a lengthy explainer when you're speaking to a source that is not familiar with it?
With hydrogen? Or
Yes.
yes, and actually that's, I don't want to say really annoying, but like I've done a few stories on hydrogen, and every time I do another story on hydrogen, I'll be talking to an editor and they'll be like, well, we have to explain what hydrogen is. And I'll be like, yeah, that's cool. I thought I just did that like 3 other times, like in the last month, but that's fine. I mean, I can explain it. It's the most abundant element in the universe, but nobody seems to know what it is. I mean, I think in part because like you don't go to the gas station and pump hydrogen into your car, you pump gasoline. People know what that is. But in terms of like a climate solution, a lot of very smart experts say that this is going to be needed in the next 30 years to decarbonize. So it's something that I and others are just going to have to keep explaining until stuff gets put in the ground and people can see what it is. So it's just comes with the
Necessary
job.
evil.
Necessary
A
evil.
necessary evil.
I just wanted to add like my little 2 cents about how you talk to sources about climate change, even if they're skeptical. And I'm a big proponent of just telling the truth to people. The truth is, we're causing climate change by burning fossil fuels, and the most sort of antagonistic people I've found towards that reality are often politicians, like governors of states. And so like, I feel like that's part of my job, is just to sort of like tell people what I know, what very, people who've studied this have found. And so that's sort of like my North Star in all this. And I'm not like a jerk about it, but I am pretty firm that it's not like really up for debate anymore. And actually, in Sweden, I was sitting on a train talking to somebody about this, and he was like, "Oh, I don't know about this climate change. I don't think we could really change the climate." And I was like, "Yes, we are." And actually, the person who sort of discovered climate change was a Swedish chemist in the late 1800s. Names, I'm gonna mangle the name, but Svante Arrhenius. And I Googled Svante Arrhenius's picture and I showed it to this guy I was traveling with, and I was like, "See, he's from Sweden. He discovered it." So it was just, he didn't really like it, didn't really affect him either way.
Mhm.
I suspect he sort of watched the equivalent of Fox News in Sweden, so he was sort of like not really amenable to, but it was just kind of a funny little situation.
Right.
I have a question for you guys who don't, or you deal more with powerful figures who deny climate change exists or is happening. Do you report that? Like, I mean, that would be I'm just wondering if that's something you report. Just in the same way, like if the governor of Oregon doesn't talk with me about something very important, I will say she declined to interview so that the public knows this, this important public figure didn't think it was worth talking about.
Yeah, I've at the Dallas Morning News, and this is not just isolated to the project. We've become very deliberately more transparent to that, to not just so and so declined a request, for an interview. We will track how many times and how we reached out to them.
But will
And
you also say, and they denied that climate change exists?
I mean, if they did say that, then yes, but in reference to they did not answer questions for this, we will say that we reached out to them X number of occasions via email to their office, via text message, calls, etc., to uh, kind of try to explain to our readers that we didn't just make a cursory effort to reach these folks. We tried very hard to reach them.
I mean, I'll just add, yes, of course, we say if they don't want to talk about something with us, but I think it's very rare now that you'll see an actual politician say climate change doesn't exist anymore. Like, I think we're sort of over that stage, but we're into other forms of climate denialism where it's sort of like, that we can talk about that later. But I just think it's pretty rare now that you'll meet somebody who's, you know, I mean, I know they're out there, but like in terms, politicians are generally smart enough not to answer that or get sort of cornered into having to answer it, especially if they're in a position where saying so would be bad for their political, profile.
Phil, let me follow up on this point that's been made here. So who's your alternative sources when the politicians that you go to for the quotes? Who do you go to if failing that in terms of an authoritative source for your stories?
Yeah, we often end up having to rely upon political strategists, folks that we can say, okay, well, the governor didn't respond or declined to answer on this, but we talked to so and so who's been, a lobbyist, for 30 years or something like that, or I mean, we've even used so yeah, political strategists, lobbyists. I mean, I don't like to use them as much, but yeah, we'd kind of have to end up relying on these folks as kind of proxies, just to give our readers a bit more of the idea of like, what is the larger what is the larger sort of attitudes for that. And we have to basically explain to folks that yes, these politicians aren't talking to us, but I mean, they are talking to, these folks who we have cultivated relationships with.
If I can just chime in with
Go ahead.
something on this too, because I think it's interesting what I'm hearing from some other folks in other parts of the country, because I think in Utah, there are politicians that are speaking out in county commission meetings, speaking like getting very angry that some economic development folks are applying for grants that just even have the word climate in it, right? So it's like they are speaking this publicly on the record in meetings. So I do think it's they aren't even it's not that they're even hesitant to say it to me. You know, it's almost like people are hesitant in some of these communities to say on the record that they do believe in climate change. Like I've talked with some folks that they'll use different words like stewardship, or say things like, I'm not an expert, I think global warming is happening, but it's always like under this premise that I'm not an expert. And it seems like they are somewhat doing that to protect themselves politically in some rural places in Utah. And I don't know if Anastasia, you've run into that too in Utah, but it's just interesting comparing how it comes up in different parts of the country, I think.
Yeah, I think that I've definitely come across that. I also have come across a willingness maybe to acknowledge some clean energy sources over others. There's this real reluctance to give up coal, but if you tell there's a really real openness to pursuing nuclear in Utah. Mainly because of this idea that it provides Utah jobs, or we're using Utah's critical minerals. But if you say, oh, we should switch completely to solar or wind, I've gotten more pushback against that idea. So that's been interesting to me, but I really do want to echo Brooke's point that I feel like a lot of elected officials where we live kind of view it as a badge of honor to say that they don't believe in climate change, that they are, they see that as something to be proud of, and they see that as something to be proud of, and what I've seen, because they're representing people whose livelihoods, whose families have come from these extractive fossil fuel industries, and have relied on those industries for generations to sustain them. So the idea that people here, as Brooke has said, clean energy transition and automatically think, I'm going to lose my job. So I found that that's kind of undergirding, I think, a lot of the pride in saying that you don't believe in climate change for a lot of local elected officials.
Can I chime in here a little bit? I just
Go ahead.
one thing that I've been noticing is that yeah, but there are definitely some folks that are very upfront and that are still elected officials in Texas that say climate change is a hoax. But I'm finding, I think the Inflation Reduction Act kind of made people change a little bit of their tune when suddenly all of this heaps and heaps of money were being offered out there, and I've been digging into that, but even, on government documents and things like that, they're basically, I've been reading grant proposals that are essentially saying, like, can we please have this money for what is essentially legislation that is supposed to address climate change. But even in those like grant proposals, they'll soften the language. If you do a control F for climate change, you won't find it in there anywhere. And then another thing that has happened to me on at least two, but I think maybe three occasions when talking to conservative politicians is that I'll ask them straight up what they, about climate change, and they'll say, yes, the climate is changing, but that doesn't mean climate change is real. So it's like addressing, so a really interesting way that that folks are talking around it. And I find this happening on the fringes of where there are folks that are actually, like, if you look at their legislative records in the past couple of years, they're actually like putting out environmentalist like legislation, but they can't come out and say that, like, this is about that. They'll just say, well, I'm being reactive to what's happening in my district where the climate is changing, but we're not going to say that it's because of the fossil fuel industry, because the fossil fuel industry in Texas is just a massive behemoth.
Sounds like a creative way around. I'd love to see what words they're actually using. So thanks for sharing. I think, the discussion so far is really interesting in that you're all finding ways to navigate the different challenges in reporting on your stories, whether that be in terminology, whether that be in sources, and in accessing information, just to make the story more accessible. So I want to come to you, back to you, Alex. So climate journalism is about specific communities and human experiences, but also it's a lot about science journalism and the complexity of this issue. And I just want to make a note here that just hearing everyone saying believe in climate change, I've spent 20 years of my life reporting on climate change outside of the United States. And this term I have never heard before, this phrase, do you believe in climate change? Because it is a fact. Whether it's rather your interpretation and the context by which you understand it, that is up for question, but not necessarily is this a belief system. It is a scientific fact. So, noting this complexity, Alex, how do you report for a non-specialist audience when it comes to the science of climate change?
Starting point is saying stuff and just seeing if anybody I'm talking to understands. When I started this, I texted a friend back. I was like, I think I was like, I'm working on this forest carbon storage and crediting project. And she just wrote back and she was like, what is forest carbon storage? And I'd become like so used to saying it in my head. And I remember we were talking about this too on one of our calls, because Reed struggles with this too, like hydrogen. Most people in the United States hadn't thought about hydrogen until the last few years. So how do you explain that? And I remember being on the call with Reed and Betsy being like, am I going to have to explain photosynthesis? Like, am I going to have to go into because I really don't want to have to do that. And, Betsy, who works with us on these, is like, well, yeah, a lot of reporters bemoan that they have to explain DNA over and over again, because it is like conceptually, you're not thinking about this a lot. You took a science class, as a kid that talked about this topic, and then you move on. And to my discredit too, like I didn't totally understand what trees could do that they weren't already doing. I thought this was more or less about expanding the acreage of forests in the world than even just preserving existing ones. So the first thing is like talking out loud with as many people as possible so I can get to a more granular idea of how to explain this. Ideally avoiding going into complex, biological. I don't need to explain photosynthesis, but I think most people understand that forests, and I can tell them that forests are taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, using it to grow. And then, to be honest, to the credit of the fellowship, I might not have even gone down this path without this support. We have a hydrogen hub out here as well, and reporting on it has not been as robust. Sorry, guys, got some noise out here. I think in part because it's so hard to explain, and you kind of need the time and the incentive to go down the rabbit holes. And that's sort of what this brought me to. I'm way more well-versed at talking about forests as a carbon capture and storage mechanism now than I was 4 months ago. I have a 6-page glossary of terms that I picked up along the way that I would just keep refining. It'd be like from 3 sentences to 1 sentence. How could I say what additionality is? How could I say what, I don't know, these basic functions are? So I think it's almost like you just have to talk to as many people as possible. So you have them continue to go like, what? That I've never heard that. What the hell are you talking about? I think that's my only like tried and true, is literally just talking out loud to as many people as possible until I can explain it in a very succinct way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Alex. And I think it's also dependent on the, on the audience, right? What audience you have and their level of understanding of the topic. And to what degree do you need to go into actually explaining photosynthesis? So interestingly, one of the projects I work on with AP was with Columbia Insight in this region, Pacific Northwest. And we produced a 3-part series on trees and the carbon offset projects and its ability. The privilege that you speak of in terms of this is not, and everyone here seems to be on the same page on climate change. Interestingly, it was difficult to find sources who would speak because of the political implications, even scientific sources. So I want to come to Brooke. Did you find that the stories you wanted to cover in this fellowship changed the course of your reporting over the period of time in the fellowship?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think like a month ago, I would have said they've changed a lot. And now that I'm getting closer to being done with this project, I'm realizing they actually are quite similar to what I initially started, but just like the depth or some of the context or the way I'm thinking about the basic story has changed. And I'll just give one example. One of the stories I wanted to look at a grant that the communities I'm covering had received from the Department of Energy. It's specifically, there's various grants from DOE right now for coal or other fossil fuel producing communities to support them in the transition. And I went in and started asking about this grant. And for basically an hour, they just talked to me about the challenges rural communities face with getting grants, managing grants. And it became like this, I just understood this grant in a much greater context of the challenges of receiving and implementing federal funds for the energy transition and what that actually means on the ground for rural communities, which is not something I necessarily thought I'd be reporting on from the outset. I also think just like some of the ways this communities talk about the transition and thus how I wanted to talk about it changed. And I think that was in part because of something I was drawn to at this fellowship is that like reporting and writing stories that are meant to reach the communities we're covering, right? And I think I appreciate that ethic just in trying to challenge some of kind of the extractive or kind of like helicopter-in aspects of journalism at times, and that this fellowship really gave us the opportunity to do in-depth reporting in these communities. And so trying to then think, how am I writing in ways that also lands with them while also still be factually accurate, but that, you know, if energy transition isn't the preferred term for everyone, like another way people are talking about it is we're trying to find ways so our kids can stay here. And we recognize coal is fading out and we have to diversify our economy. Like that is the way I'm hearing people talk about it more than like energy transition necessarily. And so placing it in that context and thinking about what is really important to these communities has, yeah, just I guess changed some of the language I use and some of the focus of the stories.
Thank you, Brooke. It's so important to like listen to your audience and know which direction they want to go on in terms of a story. So Anastasia, I'll come to you on this question. Climate journalism is also inherently about big global changes. How do you marry a story about the entire world with the local concerns your readers are looking to you to cover?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's definitely one I've been wrestling with over the course of this fellowship. Because, of course, when we're talking about climate change, we're talking about sea level rise and the global temperature rising and all of these really huge issues that if you start talking to somebody about that really there's a wall that goes up. It's really intimidating. And a lot of people think that maybe they don't have the knowledge or expertise to understand these big ramifications of climate change. So I feel like what I've really been trying to do with my reporting is, which again focuses on uranium and nuclear energy, is being able to show, okay, this solution that some say is going to be really helpful in addressing climate change. The first two steps of it, uranium mining and uranium milling, happen in Utah. And if I can get really granular on those two things, I've had one story on uranium mining. How do you get the rock out of the ground? Like, I feel like these are kind of things that we kind of gloss over and assume everybody knows how these things work. No, we don't. I didn't necessarily know until I was 700 feet below ground and I saw them hauling uranium ore out of the ground. And then showing, okay, what are the regulations involved with that? What happens to the surrounding earth? And then going into a story about uranium milling. What is a uranium mill? What happens in there? What are these chemical processes that eventually make what's mined in Utah and milled in Utah into nuclear fuel. You know, these are not being, I think this kind of goes to the question that Alex answered so well about how so much of our climate reporting is also science reporting, and having to really break down what these processes are. I have a rule that if I can't like make one of my little brothers explain it, then I probably am not doing a good job of making my readers understand something. So I think that in that challenge I have found of marrying, you know, hey, there's these really big implications of what's going on in southeastern Utah. Starts with really getting granular and explaining really carefully what is going on a local level so that you can build up to that. There's that really big picture concern. I found that kind of not holding your reader's hand, but really wanting to show the audience like I want to help explain this. I want to help clarify. I really think that is a big goal of mine as a journalist, is to clarify, is to say, how can I take this really mystifying topic that sounds really intimidating and hard to understand and make it understandable?
Thank you, Anastasia. It's a noble cause, and we must all still remember that as journalists to continue. Reed, I'll come back. I'll come to you with this question, and then really on, you know, you went to Sweden, right, already since the last time we talked, which, by the way, I love Sweden because cheese, right? Did you come away with any new appreciation of what makes climate reporting in America unique after that trip?
It's a good question. I mean, the general feeling or vibe in Sweden is like, it's not, you know, in America, there's sort of a motivated reasoning, a motivated, you know, thinking that climate change is, you know, questioning of the basic science of climate change. We're the largest oil and gas producing country in the world, and we've have very powerful industries that have for years fought against climate action and even sort of telling people what's happening. Sweden is not really like that. I mean, you know, I think, like I said, it's not like everyone there is 100% on board, but, you know, the politicians there and the political discourse there is not really a huge question about whether or not we should, you know, move away from fossil fuels. I mean, I think the reason I was in Sweden is reporting on green, so-called green steel, which is steel made with hydrogen that's produced without carbon emissions, is that Sweden doesn't really have a big oil and gas industry or fossil fuel industry. So they rely extensively on hydroelectricity and nuclear energy. So there's not, you know, there's no big oil and gas industry there to sort of like stand in the way of people, you know, talking about climate solutions. So I think, you know, it just sort of like reinforced for me what I've observed as a reporter here in the US and especially in Pennsylvania, which is, as everyone knows, historically a big fossil fuel state, is that, you know, we have a big fossil fuel lobby in the US, and they're very powerful. And all the stuff we're talking about today in this conversation is sort of downstream of all that, you know, those things people can't say in Texas or in Utah. It's all kind of downstream of where power lies in our country. So Alex mentioned something a few weeks ago, you know, in terms of like our job is to interrogate power. No matter what we're doing, but especially covering the environment and climate, it's like 100%, you know, it's all the problems that you're ever going to see. Most of them aren't like, didn't come out of nowhere, you know, they came from somewhere. So our job is to sort of like work backwards and see, where did all this come from, this climate denial. And so going to Sweden, where that stream is pretty dry, it's sort of like reinforced, you know, kind of the challenge for us as reporters in the US.
Thank you, Reed. it sounds like, the challenges are not necessarily similar, but there's also some alignment with the audiences there. So to end, I just want to do a quick round with everyone, just to give us 1 minute of highlights of the fellowship for you. What's a key highlight for you? And I'll start with Brooke.
Yeah, I'd say definitely just the support this fellowship has given to do a lot of field reporting, the both funding and time to do in-depth reporting on the ground. I think that especially when you're covering rural communities, makes a big difference in building trust and actually understanding the complexity of these stories.
Thank you. Alex?
Having the best part of this is having a reason to call up people and have like 2-hour-long conversations about what forests can do and how these markets work. And I had to go to the Colville Indian Reservation up near the Washington-Canada border. I got to go to a ton of private forests. So honestly, to be away from my computer and walk around in the woods all day was like such a gift.
Alex, that does sound like a gift. Anastasia?
Yeah, I think a highlight for me, aside from what we've talked about in terms of time and resources to go to these places where we're reporting, is all of these science resources. I 4 or 5 months ago did not know nearly as much about nuclear energy as I now do. There's a lot of science, turns out, that goes from taking a rock out of the ground and making it into a fuel rod that you can put into a reactor, and then figuring out what on earth you do with it after that. And I really was able to glean a lot from MIT's resources, just to understand what on earth is going on there. Because if I can't understand it, my reader can't. So that was a really big benefit to me.
Thanks, Anastasia. If it's any consolation to you, your knowledge is such that some of the words you're using I'm not catching on or understanding myself. So obviously you've become an expert in that time that you've had the fellowship. So I'll come to you, Reed, and then we'll end with Phil.
I mean, I'll just echo what everyone said, just kind of being able to go down a rabbit hole and not feel like I have to get out very quickly anytime soon. But also just, being able to go to Sweden, and I would have never been able to do that. I got to see the world's first commercial green steel plant ever being built. This huge $5 billion facility going up right before my eyes, 60 miles from the Arctic Circle. So that was like pretty cool.
Thanks, Reed. You do know that only an environmental journalist will say that as the highlight of their trip to Sweden.
There are other great things about Sweden.
I love
Stockholm is
that.
lovely. I would really recommend it if you ever have the chance.
Thanks. Go ahead.
Yeah, kind of, plus one to what everyone said, especially the MIT resources. This has been truly a major learning experience for me. Maybe as much as anyone else in this fellowship this round. This has given me a real different knowledge base about climate change that I don't think I would have otherwise, and I truly believe that will influence my coverage on Texas's power industry as long as I'm covering it.
Thank you, Phil. And that ends my part of this discussion. I just want to thank you all for sharing your projects. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our audiences have learned a lot. And Aaron, next time this has to be like a 6-hour discussion, because I feel like there's still a lot that we can learn. Thanks again for sharing and for the opportunity to moderate this discussion both times.
It has been such a pleasure to have you, Lagipoiva, and I'm excited to start the Q&A portion now. I'm seeing a lot of great questions, which means I too wish we had more time, because I had some questions I really wanted to ask too. But I will start with our listeners' questions. And I just also want to add that I really appreciate hearing how you all have benefited from this fellowship. It's really heartening to me. And Alex, I need to devise some project from this program that will pay me to walk around in the woods for a while. That would be really nice. I want to start with this question that was directed to Anastasia, but that I think a couple of our other fellows can actually speak to as well, which was about reporting you're doing on nuclear development in a region where that is opposed by tribal nations and indigenous organizations. This person asks, how do you build and maintain relationships with those kinds of sources at the same time that you're building and maintaining relationships with rural ranchers and resource extractors and other folks who might be opposed not only on nuclear, but even on issues of sort of indigenous sovereignty?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So thank you for that. This is actually kind of, I think, my favorite part of my job is being able to have sources that really disagree with each other. And because I feel like my job really is to just give the most complete story possible. So as far as your question about like how I build and maintain relationships with sources in tribal organizations and in tribal governments, it's always just about giving them a call or going down there if I absolutely can. Because those relationships really matter. If I don't have the point of view of the Navajo Nation president, for example, if I don't have the point of view of the Mountain Ute Tribe's White Mesa community, which lives like 5 miles south of the uranium mill I've been reporting on, I don't have the whole story, and I'm doing a disservice. So I really have maintained those relationships, I think, by always reaching out, always saying, and also reaching out when there's not necessarily a story on the line, just kind of giving somebody a call on a Wednesday afternoon, like, hey, is there anything that I should know about? Am I missing anything? Has anything come up? And I found that has really gone a long way, just in making sure that my reporting is as rounded out as it can be. And sometimes there are sources who give me a call, they're like, hey, I didn't like that this other person said this in your story. And it's like, well, I had to put both of you in conversation with each other. That's kind of, how it works. I really do value that part of this job. It's really difficult sometimes when sources you rely on are so diametrically opposed. But again, like with a topic as complicated as nuclear energy and uranium production in this area of the country, you have to make sure that you've got sources that are willing to give you their point of view so that your audience can glean the information they need.
If I can just add one thing too, I think sometimes being transparent with people who are opposed on a similar issue about the fact that you're talking to one another on either side is helpful. I think sources tend to feel, they don't want to feel bamboozled when they read the story and be like, well, I wish I would have known they talked to this person because then I might have into greater depth about this other thing. Like sometimes I think just saying, I've talked to this group that thinks, or even like specific reporting that calls something out. When I went to the Colville Indian Reservation, it's the second largest forest carbon project in the California regulatory market. It's been the subject of intense scrutiny and other reporting about whether or not it's actually capturing additional carbon dioxide. And more than half of that project has burned in the last 10 years. Since 2014. So if I go in and I say, like point blank, these are some of the things I'm reading. I talked to somebody who said this, and then give people the chance to respond so that they know, I guess, just the idea of like letting people understand they're going to be put in concert with each other and not have that be a surprise when they read the story.
Yeah, I found it's really important that my sources know exactly why I'm talking to them. Like I'm talking to you because I really want this point of view for this story that the goal of is explanatory. I think that you're exactly right, Alex, being able to tell people like, hey, like I've also talked to these people. Have you heard of them? Or, and just being as transparent as possible, because again, that's how you get the most information you can. And then you can present it in a way that is valuable to others.
Really interesting question here. I want to bring out. A lot of you have focused your reporting on controversial projects, uncertain projects. How well is this actually going to work for the climate? So someone here asked what strategies you use to check your own biases that you might come into the story with, thinking initially, oh, I think this side is probably right.
I'll start to answer. I don't know, but I'm just trying to come into these stories with a little humility, and just knowing that you probably are biased in one way or another. You just lean one way. You're a human. It's fine, but just knowing that there's other perspectives that you're not immediately going to just look for. So like an example from my trip to Sweden is like a couple days before I left, I was just talking to a Swedish journalist who has covered some of these issues before, and he turned me on to this the idea that like not everybody in Sweden is so happy about the fact that there's so much hydroelectric in the Arctic region, notably the Sami people, which are sort of like they are the native indigenous people of northern Scandinavia, are, have a long history of resource extraction and exploitation and all the things that you would find in, Anastasia's story in the American Southwest, a lot of same pattern of sort of resource colonialism occurred in northern Scandinavia in the early 20th century. So like just sort of things like that, where you'd be like, oh, all this clean energy, maybe not so great. Not everybody is, has a great feeling about all this. So just things like that, where you just sort of have to be open to what you find and what you hear.
Yeah, and I think just to build on that, there have been some unexpected solutions in my reporting. I went in covering the transition in coal country, and a lot of the solutions that region is drawn to as a next step are things like nuclear and carbon capture and some of these technologies that are more controversial, as others have spoken to. And I think for me, it's been really trying to understand like why are those the desired next steps for this community, and like understanding why those are most appealing, and just where my sources are coming from. So I think it's like, yeah, approaching with humility and also just curiosity, to understand why these are the solutions that this community is choosing.
I see a question here I absolutely have to draw out, because several of you cited, being able to tap into MIT resources to learn about new topics like, like nuclear energy, for instance, Anastasia. And someone is curious about what those resources were, what you were actually doing when you were learning. And I'd love to hear that myself. What specifically has been helpful here that advance your reporting.
Yeah, I can start that off. I really got a lot of use out of the MIT climate portal, which you can just kind of Google and go to and search to your heart's content. I had the page for nuclear energy bookmarked. It's really a pretty short page, written mostly by Ann White, who's a professor at MIT, of nuclear science and engineering. So I knew exactly where that source came from. And, I'll just read the first sentence on this kind of page. It just says, nuclear energy is energy made by breaking the bonds that hold particles together inside an atom. That's nuclear fission. That's an explanation of nuclear fission. If you just tell someone, yeah, you make energy with nuclear fission, no one knows what that means. So this kind of way of really breaking down, like, no, you're breaking the bonds that hold atoms together. Okay, that's something I can like start to picture in my head. It's also, really good explanations of, I've found in my reporting, people in my audience really take issue with calling nuclear energy clean, because they argue that the process there might not burn any or produce any carbon, but the process toward actually getting the fuel in the reactor is not clean. So being able to explain, okay, this is carbon free, it does not directly produce carbon dioxide. These are all things that I found, on just on this page specifically, but when I've searched nuclear on the MIT climate portal before, there's kind of maybe some news. I know Phil and I were talking about a nuclear reactor that was approved in Texas relatively recently. These hypotheticals, could nuclear energy be used for transportation, like in a car? All of these questions that I really found useful in terms of just broadening my understanding of a really complicated topic that clearly a lot of people at MIT have PhDs about, but we're able to really break down and distill into something I could understand.
We also, with the fellowship, spent like the first, sorry, my wiener dog. We spent the first few days, or like a week. The first week of the fellowship was literally sitting down with some of the experts at MIT virtually and experimenting with this En-ROAD simulator, which was so awesome. And I've actually included it in like at least 2 stories, because it'll basically allow you to toggle the buttons on any sort of policy change or massive shift in energy use or generation. It's like basically sort of the Oz of if you tinkered with this, how would it change the outcome by the year 2100 when we look at climate change? And like one of the most revealing things for me was just seeing like there are some pretty easy policy things you could do. They're just expensive and absolutely not palatable to corporate industrial interests. But at least I get to turn to the audience and say, especially when it comes to carbon pricing, which is one of the most effective policy decisions you could make to rapidly accelerate the defossilization of our fuels, is to say, on the voluntary carbon market, a credit, 1 metric ton of carbon dioxide released into the atmosphere forever, it's going to sell for $7. This simulator says the reality is it needs to be closer to $350 to reflect the true social price of carbon dioxide per metric ton. So at the very least, the audience has an idea of where we're at and what the true price of this should be. So that when I talk about ExxonMobil investing millions of dollars into carbon credits, they can see the reality is in a much stricter regulatory world in which we enforce things for the true cost they burdened us all with, ExxonMobil would be paying trillions of dollars for what they are doing and have done. I don't know that I would have ended up in that simulator or with the confidence to be able to report some of these things if I hadn't like spent time with somebody figuring out what that it exists and B, how it works. So it's honestly affirming to talk with experts at MIT about some of this stuff because they can say point blank, you're on the right path, or yes, this is here's a body of research to corroborate the thought that you're trying to express.
Can I add to that? I agree with that too, but yeah, just familiarize that specific tool, familiarizing ourselves with that was interesting, and it came up in my reporting when I learned about a grant program that our environmental commission in Texas a proposal that they sent where they used essentially like a very, very similar tool. And was like looking at that and knowing the context that like they are going to they're going to try everything except for a carbon tax. And to have that in my head to know that like, okay, here's what they're like proposing as a way to actually reduce carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, but knowing just immediately as soon as I saw what sort of knobs they were playing with on this one, which is called the Energy Policy Simulator by Energy Innovation, which allows you to do the same stuff but by state, which is cool. But just knowing that like whatever they were doing immediately upon seeing it was like this is going to be like an exercise in futility for them. And then the other thing that I wanted to add related to the was access to the library materials, knowing that I could just see Google something on Google Scholar, see a like research paper that sounded interesting, was a real for the first couple of months I really kind of did a deep dive into that stuff. I found that a whole lot of fun to do. The most sort of like obscure thing that I was able to do was that I discovered that there's like something called a like there's a forest nearby where I live that like if it burns down it won't grow back, like because it's because the habitat has changed so much. They call it a relict habitat. And I was like, I don't know, I'm gonna look up this thing, and then like was able to find like a 35 or 40-year-old like paper that was an inventory of the species of plants and animals that lived in that specific forest that was like basically handwritten. I was like, this is wild, like just to be able to do that within a couple of minutes. I don't think that's going to end up in any of my stories, but I just thought that was so fun to mess around with. Got me really just excited about reporting on all this in general.
Man, thank you all for sharing that. As the representative from MIT here, I feel like I should say that if any of you out there want to check out some of these resources, several of them are free and available. You can go to climate.mit.edu to check out that climate portal with those explainers. You can also look up Climate Interactive, which is the spinoff from MIT that shares that En-ROADS climate policy simulator, and you can find ways to use it yourselves. Another audience question I want to bring out. I might direct this one to Phil first. We've talked a lot about sort of engaging politicians as sources. We've talked about engaging various community groups, but somebody here is interested in engaging with private industry and corporations. What is that like? What are your strategies to do it productively in a way that sort of advances your reporting and still keeps your reporting sort of accurate and unbiased? Phil, you're on mute there.
Sorry. First of all, I want to say shout out to Lore, who I see in the Q&A, asking a question. Nice to see you in chat, I guess. But anyway, sorry. I already forgot what the question was. How do I interface with industry? Was that it? Well, I mean, I'm sorry, this answer is not going to be the best one. I've been covering like the energy industry for since early 2021. We had a bad storm that knocked out power for like over half the state, and that's kind of what shifted me over to energy coverage, because everybody realized there was really something wrong with our power grid, which honestly just like led into covering those. So I've been source building with these companies for a long time. They see me at the Capitol building, and they know that I write about their companies. So after I'd written about them enough, they see that it's in their best interest to not run and hide from me. The opposite end of that, though, is, I mean, the other, and so that's, I'm talking about like the legacy fossil fuel, natural gas, folks. They are, I've been cultivating those relationships for a while. The opposite end of that, though, is the folks that are trying more new technologies like wind and solar and battery storage. Those people are eager, very, very eager to talk about their emerging technologies. I mean, yeah, I think Alex, you used the term startup energy. That's kind of like a bit of what I'm encountering with those folks, but they are doing some really, really substantial stuff in Texas. So I don't mean to like I'm not saying anything bad about what they're doing, because it's truly wild what's going on in there in that space. So yeah, I've then where I do see some pushback is just in the more so the West Texas guys that are actually like pumping oil and natural gas out of the ground. That's a bit more of like a insulated community, not only geographically, but just just a little far more sort of and feeling antagonized by what's going on. But compared to the politicians, it's so much easier to get those folks on the phone. Plus, it's such a massive industry that it's, if one company turns me down, there's 300 or 400 at least more that I can go to.
Yeah, I can speak a little. I think I have a different experience in that, though. I need to talk to one company a lot. They own a uranium mine in Utah. They own a uranium mine near the south rim of the Grand Canyon, and they own the last conventional uranium mill in the United States. So 2 of the 3 are in Utah. So I have to talk to them a lot, as you might imagine. And that has been a really interesting relationship, just because they don't always like what I write, even if it's accurate, even when it's right, even when, I've done my very best to be balanced and I've run every single thing by them. They don't like it, but I think that kind of, as Phil said, a lot of companies are realizing that it's more beneficial for them to say their piece than to run away from the media. Because otherwise, if there's just kind of this company had no comment, well, people will fill that silence in with whatever they want to fill it in with. So navigating that relationship for me, just because it is so important that I get their point of view and that I understand, like, here's why they're frustrated with these concerns, or here's why they think these concerns are completely unfounded. But being able to remind them, like, I'm not accountable to you. I don't do PR for you. I am accountable to my audience and my readership. So it's definitely been a big learning experience. And I've really been grateful for, just kind of figuring that out along the way. But it's definitely something that's on my mind a lot. And it's really important to make sure that you are being accurate and fair in your writing.
Can I bring in one other layer to this? I was just thinking about as you were talking, I resonate with that. Like, we're not their PR person, and it is a lot of dealing with the industry's PR person, whatever company you're working with. But I think an additional challenge of kind of intersecting with industry is interviewing folks who work for that industry, who work for the company, that are not in like a, CEO, spokesperson role. A lot of my sources who work for the power plant, for example, in the region I'm covering, would get pretty nervous and, want to read the story before I published it. And I, have to say, I can't let you read that. And, but we do thorough fact checking and things like that. But just this anxiety about saying something that will make them lose their job. And so I think that's like another layer of, as a journalist trying to not do harm myself, how to cover industries and respect my sources and make sure I'm not causing harm in how I cover that industry, if that makes sense.
I think we have time for one or two more audience questions. Here's one I'm really excited about. How was your how were your reporting projects, which are still ongoing at this point? How have they been received in your newsrooms, and do you think they might have any impact on how your editors, your colleagues, your broader newsrooms cover climate issues going forward?
So mine will roll out next week, but part of mine has been reporting on a state forest in Oregon that's going to be completely enrolled in a voluntary carbon market, which is rare for a state forest. And it's only possible in Oregon because it's owned by the Department of State Lands, not the Department of Forestry, which would never do that. And those stories have been really well received. I will say, to the point of another question that somebody asked about, sort of dealing with the platform you're speaking on or writing for. Does your newspaper or outlet feel, any need to censor or water down or mitigate whatever you're saying? No, I cannot have like more freedom and support to do what I want. The beauty of working for a nonprofit news outlet. And I feel like the net here is that this is stuff we would not have covered and in this depth without the incentive and opportunity. So we talked a bit about this at the beginning of the fellowship. A lot of us are under the gun to produce stuff daily. And it's a lot of work. I mean, I have 2 beats across an entire state. And I think the general reception to this was like, let's give it a shot because we otherwise wouldn't do this. So in general, I think I feel like I have a lot of shared gratitude about just being able to do this.
I think something that my newsroom has been thinking about a lot, like that's kind of grown out of my doing this project, is how we can better explain these complicated things. I feel like that's what I've talked about for half of this webinar, but we have a really wonderful graphics team at the Tribune, a really wonderful videographers, photographers who are, able to really put visuals next to the words that I write, and kind of the role of that, and how sometimes, me writing, 5 paragraphs is less useful to a reader than a graphic that shows how rock turns into yellow cake, for example. So I've been thinking a lot about that, and we've been having a lot of discussions about, what is the kind of best way to present this kind of information. So I have really been grateful for those discussions that we're having, because it is, it really is just all about, at the end of the day, like, can we clarify and make these complicated topics more clear and understandable?
I'll just add that it's been really nice for me to be able to like go hardcore into hydrogen because like honestly, it's sort of something that is like a kind of a wave that we can see building in the surf, but like it's not really here yet, but we know it's coming. And otherwise, I'd probably just be doing sort of triage on that beat, just like kind of saying what's happening, what we know, and then like getting out. But this has allowed me, like for instance, the steel story. This isn't a solution that's coming tomorrow to the United States, but it could be here in like 5 or 10 years. And, I live about 20 miles from the largest coke plant in North America. It's a very huge air polluter and makes people sick in Pittsburgh and Allegheny County where I live. And, my kids have asthma. Probably, I wonder how much of that is from this steel plant. And it's a very live conversation here. Like, can we clean this industry up? And, apart from climate change, like, what is the future of the steel industry? Are we just going to keep burning coal like forever and ever and like keeping these huge steel plants going the way they've been going for the last 100 years? Or so it's a very like opportune moment for me and our newsroom to sort of get ahead and be like, well, there's this other way that you can do it. It's not going to be easy, but this is the way to do it.
All right, with apologies to all the audience members whose questions we haven't answered in the last 5 minutes, I have one of my own that I really want to ask. As someone who writes about climate change myself, an evolution I've gone through is sort of going from seeing myself as just answering one question or explaining one topic to sort of equipping people to ask different questions or think different ways about other topics, other news stories they might hear. That resonated for me, Alex, when you were talking about sort of the idea that there's no silver bullet in this. We need to look at a whole suite of solutions. Like that's something that more and more I feel like I'm trying to contribute to that perspective. So if I can put you guys on the spot, what are some things you hope readers will bring from your reporting on these projects to other stories that they read, to other climate issues that they might hear about? Ways you might change their thinking beyond just about the immediate thing you're reporting on. Alex, I'm seeing enough nodding that I hope I can start with you.
Yeah, mine might be like very specific because it is something that I've been thinking a lot about, especially when it comes to forest carbon and the potential for wildfire. And maybe this is like not that revelatory to everybody, but it was to me, and I cover a lot of wildfire. Burnt forests still store a ton of carbon. In fact, they hold on to most of it. I mean, it will degrade and be released, but the idea that a burnt forest, I can't tell you how many people I talk to who are like, if I see one more headline from newspapers about that one study in California that said it released more carbon dioxide emissions in one, wildfire season than it had been able to shave off of its, emissions count for the last however many years. All these forest ecologists, fire ecologists, scientists are like, that is so not the case. Burnt forests hold their carbon. They are so critical to habitat. The idea that that's just a total X out is really counterproductive. That was a big thing for me to take away. And it's a big thing for me to take away from the idea that a carbon market is essentially trying to preserve forests so that they can better suck up our carbon dioxide. So I would hope readers after this, one big takeaway is Carbon markets aren't a silver bullet. The most effective thing you could do is put a carbon tax on, and a burnt forest is still a really critical, healthy bank of carbon, not only for us, but for, every living thing that depends on them.
If I could jump in, I'd like to just I'd like the our readers to take away from the project just basically a better understanding of Texas's role in impacting climate change on on a global level, because I think there was a lot of the when I've had some people punt on answering about climate change, one of the common refrains is it doesn't matter because what China is doing. And like what I want to say is that like what happens in the state it actually really does matter. And so just clearly and in any chance possible, clearly explaining just how much Texas's impact is, how much greenhouse gas it emits in context to the rest of the nation, which is more than twice as much as any other state in the country, including California, which has 35% more people in it than Texas. That Texas is on the level of Germany, a country that has 2.5 times more people than it when it comes to greenhouse gases. That Texas is an incredible producer of oil and gas, and that's the reason that happens, that Texas ranks just behind Saudi Arabia on how much oil and gas just comes from this state. So it's a different thing. I think it's different from a lot of y'all that I taking like a larger look at the states in the context of the globe.
Reed, I'm going to point to you next.
I think the sort of, one of the stories that I'm working on is sort of like, there's sort of two basic stories about this steel story that I'm working on. One is sort of the science, how does it work? Like, there's a lot of stuff I learned that I hope my readership or listenership will take away. But probably like the more important or the bigger thing is like, why are they doing this in Sweden and not in the United States? And the real simple answer is because they have a carbon tax and they feel like or they will in a few years. So like, I think just this sort of real basic thing of like, if you want something to happen, you just have to make the policies to make that happen. And this isn't really about technology, although obviously technology is part of it. It's always about collective decision making, and what kind of problems we want to solve. And if we want to solve climate change, there is a solution. There are solutions, but we just have to kind of do it. So,
Brooke?
Yeah, I think I guess it's interesting because I think, yeah, there's like these big picture solutions, right? Like a carbon tax or carbon pricing. And then I think though with my stories, the takeaway is more like, what does that actually look like at a very local level on the ground? And that when we get to especially rural communities and most historic and current fossil fuel producing communities in this country are rural, that the solutions and pathways forward are actually quite complicated. There isn't a silver bullet like Alex was speaking to, and that the people that are genuinely trying to chart a path forward are just facing so many obstacles, whether it's, resistance from their local politicians or financial challenges, smaller populations, you have a smaller local budget, challenges in getting federal grants. It's just like the obstacles, I think one of my sources, a quote was, we're just trying to keep our heads above water. So just that like, this is a massive challenge on the local level, and that if we care about keeping rural communities alive in these transitions, we need to listen more to what those people are saying they need.
I'm happy to wrap us up. I really hope that readers are able to take from my reporting a lot of what Brooke just said. We're covering some similar areas, and I've definitely seen a lot of that. But one thing I've really seen through my own reporting is that I don't know if we always talk about solutions to climate change as a particularly emotional issue. But I've really seen that in my own reporting, that the idea of uranium mining or milling happening in someone's backyard is a really, really emotional issue. It is something that really and the feedback I've gotten to my reporting, I've gotten a lot of very, very anti-nuclear and very, very pro-nuclear, and not a lot in the middle ground. And I think that I hope that readers are able to look at the other solutions out there and understand that it's not going to be a silver bullet kind of situation, more of a silver buckshot, if anything, and that there are really some emotional ramifications behind deciding whether to like shut down a coal plant or to start up a uranium mine, and that there's that angle as well. And I'm hoping that people can really think about that, even if they're, reading something I've written in from, wherever our audience is located today. I think that's a kind of something I'm wanting to elevate a little bit more in the future as well.
Well, I learned a lot just from your answers right there. So I mean, and from this entire 90 minutes, I want to thank you all for joining this and for the really, really cool projects. It's been such a pleasure to see develop over this fellowship. I want to thank everyone in the audience for joining us for this event. It's really been a pleasure, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of your days.
Thanks so much, y'all.
Thank you.
Thank you.